In 1999, philosopher Peter Singer published A Darwinian Left. And in 2002, cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker published The Blank Slate. Both books were centered on similar arguments. Singer argued that an evolutionary understanding of human nature should be incorporated into the worldview of the political left. And Pinker argued that this understanding should become better accepted in the social sciences. 20 years later, both the left and the social sciences still show strong resistance to a Darwinian understanding of mankind. My guest for this episode, Gary Edwards, advocates a better integration of the social in the natural sciences and the adoption in the latter of a naturalistic approach. Well, so hi everyone. I'm delighted to be talking to Gary Edwards tonight. Gary, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So, you would like to be introduced simply as a YouTube philosopher, as an internet philosopher.
That's right,
So
yes.
that will do for tonight. With interests in philosophical naturalism, you have a background in analytical philosophy. Yeah.
That's right, yes. Anglophone, analytic, pro-naturalism. So, and I was particularly interested in the naturalization of the social sciences and some of the issues that surround that particular debate.
And so what got you interested in this debate?
Well, I think I started off, I'm one of those annoying people who started off perhaps on the other side and made a transition. When I was in my 20s, say the 1990s, it was very much the first wave of intersectionality and that kind of radical political, and I was part of that. That's where my associations lied at that time. But as I studied more, perhaps I remember at the time there was quite a healthy naturalism. In the beginning of the 90s, it was the Churchlands and the Dennets, and there was that kind of sort of like thing was going. And then David Chalmers came along, and it was reclaimed a little bit. The philosophy of mind was reclaimed a little bit, perhaps more to a more humanities friendly kind of way. And I went with that for a while. But as I studied it more, and I got more into what the sort of like the naturalists were actually saying and their arguments, I thought there was actually perhaps more to it than they were given credit for. And that kind of sort of like, well, hold on, this does make some kind of sense. And as I got more into the formal kind of side aspect of philosophy, the logic and the epistemology of knowledge, the naturalistic stuff actually resonated with me. I'm still politically progressive. I still am to this day, even though I subscribe to Quillette. There's a lot in Quillette that I don't agree with politically. I'm a democratic socialist, member of the Labour Party, and all of those kind of things. But I think there's a possibility of what you could call an empirical left. Mm-hmm. You could make a progressive political case in the social sciences on an empirical scientific basis rather than the particular kind of conceptual analysis that seems to dominate in certain circles of the humanities, ones that have come to prominence particularly over the last 5 years or so. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, I've been active. I've sort of been involved in the internet for years and years, and since all Usenet and all the stuff in the 90s. So just recently, it's been an interesting thing to see these two things reconverge. When I first came on the internet, I was first on YouTube in 2006, like September. Like that's just over a year after it was launched. Yeah. But my first kind of videos that I did on YouTube and stuff were sort of, your typical atheist kind of thing. But then this phenomena occurred, as you know, around the time of Gamergate and all that kind of thing took off. Right. And to my surprise, I saw these two things coming back together. Now, I was very reluctant to talk about politics, but that's changed now, and I'm actually interested now in combining the two, and that comes down to the issues around the naturalization of social science.
Hmm. I've noticed that you, I mean, now I'm not shocked by this at all, but I'm still able to notice it apparently that you've said that you subscribe to philosophical naturalism, but yet you are still committed to left of center politics. There seems to be some amount of contradiction to be resolved in this formulation.
It certainly seems to be a contradiction in the eyes of some. It's not in my eyes. I cannot say. And I know there are others who are interested in what you could call an empirical left, a left that's based in what the natural sciences can tell us about the social sciences, and I don't see that as necessarily entailing the horrors that some seem to think follow from it.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe we can sort of explore these issues in more detail. We can explore the question of what is philosophical naturalism, what it can bring to the social sciences, why it is not already sort of front and center in the social sciences, what could be gained from more naturalism in the social sciences, and what some fear would be lost by bringing more naturalism in the social sciences.
Or indeed gained. Some people, judging by some recent articles that have found some notoriety around Twitter, there's a fear that naturalism brings some very unfortunate baggage to the social sciences. Yeah. It's an interesting question. It's an historical question, of course. It comes from competing traditions. For example, in America, there has been in particular, there was a healthy naturalistic approach. Well, I'll say healthy. It was a naturalistic approach. How it bore fruit, again, that can be seen as being politically controversial. But naturalism has often found a place in the social sciences because it's so ubiquitous. Naturalism has been the major methodological and thus, to some degree, ontological approach for research, for demonstrative scientific research, certainly since the early 19th century, but perhaps more so in Anglophone tradition philosophy than continental philosophy,
Sure.
which took a somewhat different path post Kant, and I think that's certainly influenced the different attitudes. Empirical theories, for example, I think part of the reason why empirical theories these days are seen as being necessarily controlling, and empirical theories do what they do best is predict and explain. They predict with accuracy, and they give you causal explanations that have several kind of virtuous things about them which you'd want. That in itself is seen as suspicious. That it's an article of political control. That why would you want to do that unless you're up to no good?
Mm-hmm.
I think that has roots in neo-Kantian thought and the way that influenced sort of sociologists like Weber, and it also came out in Heidegger and people like that as well. And I think that kind of eschewal of empiricism is somehow suspect. Is part of a body of critical theory that is very influential in the humanities, more so in the humanities than obviously in the STEM fields, but has come to prominence again. How faithful, and this is interesting. Speaking to other French philosophers, how faithful the American interpretation of French philosophy seems to be something of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
The American Academy, which found itself in opposition perhaps to Reagan and Bush, took the French philosophers of the Fifth Republic French philosophers at the end of the 60s in a particular kind of way, which doesn't always, I find, go down well with actual people who are connected with that school of thought. But it certainly has had a certain influence. And I think a lot of the reaction that we experience today against the very idea of of bringing, say, the life sciences to bear on our understanding of social phenomena, it's in that distinction between the philosophical traditions.
Yeah. To be perhaps even more specific, what would a naturalistic approach in the social sciences look like? What do the dominant approaches at the moment look like? And I mean, it's hard. It might be hard for some in the audience to hear that in the social sciences. What one wouldn't be a naturalist? That okay? Are they super naturalists?
It doesn't necessarily mean that they believe in spooky stuff.
Of course not.
It can be. It tends to entail some form of what you could perhaps call of idealism, of an approach to looking at the world wherein the mind, the operation of the mind, is in the foreground.
Right.
Act and phenomena are in the foreground, and events, and if not noumena, then at least naturalistic things that are independent of the mind are backgrounded.
Mm-hmm.
That's seen as being particularly good approach to study, or it's a necessary approach to study the social worlds. Otherwise, bad things happen. I mean, there was another article that came up that Claire Lehman was interacting with by a guy called Tom Wyman, who was titled "People Keep Trying to Bring Back Phrenology," and that was in a publication called Outline, I believe. And the premise of that seemed to be that any move towards the naturalistic approach, where you have mind-independent measurements of things that are independent of the mind, informing our understanding of social phenomena, is pretty much a lapse into phrenology. Is akin to that, and the evils of positivism, as it tends still to be called, interestingly, in those fields. Not that there's any positivists anymore, but it's called these evils of positivism, and it represents a certain demographic taking control of the narrative, etc., etc. So yeah, there seems to be a reaction, deep discomfort, with some historical justifications given, eugenics and all the things that have happened in the past. That explain bringing lessons from the life sciences to the social sciences is just a terrible idea, and everybody does it is on the internet, the intellectual dark web, and has sympathies with a particular type of right-wing science commentator, far-right science commentator on the internet. And we know that these people exist, and we know what they do. They gish gab of concepts and data that isn't necessarily conducive to their point, but their audience can't tell it. They'll assume there's some collaboration with people like that simply because you think that the naturalistic approach might be pertinent.
What do you think the extent of this situation is? Do you think that people who are really resisting, who are hostile to a more naturalistic approach in the social sciences, are really a majority in the social sciences? Do you think they are a loud minority? Do you think it's just impossible to know?
Judged by amplitude, they're massive, but by their actual representation, I think the picture's more mixed.
Mm-hmm.
I think the scary thing, perhaps sometimes, is that people who don't agree with them are somewhat intimidated to express their disagreement. I think that's a problem, but it's certainly the most ambitious, perhaps, to have an effect in the real world. That the people who see it as being a problem, they know where they're going politically. They know what they want. They've got an eye on power and placing people.
Right.
They know where their graduates go and get jobs, and they're quite happy with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was this series of articles. I'm sure you're familiar with them, by Mark Horowitz and colleagues, concerning attitudes among sociology, I think it was in particular, concerning, various questions, various hypotheses. They were asked, can some hypotheses be perhaps, just investigated or be conceived concerning, among others, the question of whether differences in personalities between men and women can be in part related to biological factors. And one could see that there was at least, a sort of relatively strong minority of people who are very close to these hypotheses.
Yeah, it's almost a forbidden framework to consider the question in. There's a prohibition on suggesting it, even perhaps as a measurable hypothesis, and there's a lot of effort often put into ruling out future research programs or ruling out the possibility of research in its, as something you could, you shouldn't even really consider. Even though, and that's at a time when the tools by which we research these things are improving dramatically. Our means of sifting the data and actually designing the experiments is improving greatly. And at the same time, perhaps not coincidentally, there's a greater resistance to, well, should we even consider it in this way so as to research? Should we even entertain the hypotheses? Yeah, and I don't know, that just seems like a negation of one's obligations as a scientist, if one is indeed a scientist, and as somebody who's generally perhaps still on board with the Enlightenment program of dare to know, sapere aude. We need, that seems to be a bit of negation of that responsibility, and maybe that, I have sympathies with that, and I still think a lot of people do have sympathies with that. They think, well, maybe we should know, even if it's not what we want. We find what we don't want. It might still be better to know, because we can either be better prepared or better know how to work around it. So yeah, it's disturbing, and this is the question. Often, of course, this is dressed up in the language of scientism, and that's an interesting issue, because any attempts to apply, say, what you'd have some kind of system whereby you could use models and hypotheses and theories that draw their concepts and their ordering of categories from the biological life sciences, and then you could use those to revise revise the concepts in your experiment and test out these revised models. So if you like a Ramsey-Lewis kind of method, like analytic naturalism, and you could use something like that. But any suggestion that you might be able to do that, revise a concept, and the big concepts of things like IQ and things like that. One of the things that scientific naturalistic research demonstrates is that nature doesn't pay much regard to the way human beings happen to conceptualize things. Things that seem unitary to us, like memory, are actually incredibly fragmented when you actually take them apart in terms of natural causation. Whereas things that seem distinct in our conceptualizations, like, depression and anxiety, are actually much more closely linked than our conceptualization. It's about revising folk theories. But you suggest anything like that, and you will be accused of scientism, which is interesting. You will be accused of being excessive and thinking strangely that science is the answer to everything. You're not bringing that. Saying science can contribute and science can revise, but the accusation there, because it's to hand, back to Heidegger, it's to hand that you can sort of it's there, it's a weapon you have, it's something you can use to make the science go away. It's the charge of scientism. Now, there's criticism of things that are called scientism that are very worthwhile. You can't do philosophy by science. There's a lot of things. There are subtle methodological differences and not so subtle methodological differences. But I don't think it's scientism to claim that we may be able to revise our concepts in social science in the light of biological life sciences. And in fact, I think it's probably, given the current situation with regards to the health of the planet, deeply irresponsible to try to rule out that possibility. We may well be in a situation where we've turned the natural world against us somewhat in our irresponsibility. And if that's the case, I think ignoring the way that social phenomena emerge out of natural phenomena could be quite irresponsible.
Yeah. When you encounter resistance, hostility, not, on an individual scale, but you've encountered.
Sometimes on an individual.
Yeah, of course. I know it does. But the question concerns maybe the sort of statistical scale, like throughout the years and over different sort of platforms and etc. Do you think that what sort of fuels this hostility is just simply political considerations? Do you think it has to do with chauvinism of the social sciences, something that would, people trying to sort of protect their disciplines from encroachment, what they see as encroachment by the natural sciences? Do you think it is that the people who oppose this resistance simply think that, the models and the frameworks that have been developed in the social sciences are just very good and they don't really need any help from the natural sciences? It's probably all of the three.
Yeah, I mean, just certainly that. I mean, look, to be honest with you, the way that the academy has been funded and incentivized and managed over the last 40 years, what you call broadly the neoliberal model, doesn't help. It just tends to set departments and fields against other fields in pursuit of goodies, research grants and so forth. But even given that, it's a perverse kind of physics envy to some degree, or a perverse kind of scientism in itself to some degree. In that they feel that many people in the humanities feel compelled to model the natural sciences as if they've been forced to do that, as if it's some kind of ideal. And of course, Hack's second sign of scientism is very similar to cargo cult science, where you feel the need to emulate this new successful thing that you encounter. It was interesting. One of the most interesting things about the so-called squared hoax was the way that the grievance studies papers, which used mathematical language, were accepted much more readily than the ones that didn't. Even though Lindsay had very skillfully crafted nonsense on purpose, the fact that it was in mathematical language was seen as being, see, we do it as well. We're doing maths as well. Maths is difficult. We're doing maths. We're proper scientists. We're hard maths. So that kind of thing. And, that's unfortunate. I mean, they're forced into that to some degree. But even so, the degree of hostility, it's not just that. There is some genuine kind of feeling that the approaches of the natural sciences, like I was saying earlier, for example, the focus on prediction and causal explanation is sinister. There's the Verhulsten, the idea that it's that the social sciences should primarily be interpretive. You should actually sort of it should be about engaging with material in the same way perhaps that one engages with a work of narrative art, and you live it from the inside and you have charity and all these kind of things. That's uniquely well suited and has gained say over any sort of extensional understanding. That's clearly part of it as well. But then again, that's a useful tool, isn't it? Because you can just make science go away if it says things that you don't like. If it's saying things that don't fit your reactive attitudes or your reactive attitude preference, the ones you like, or your intuitives, sort of intuitive moral benevolence to others or whatever. If it's questioning that, you can say, well, that's just inappropriate. I think that's the theme that runs through through all of the history of perhaps critical theory as well. All the schools of critical theory have been interpretivist. I think the latter schools, which you could broadly describe as postmodern, were as well, but they were at the same time they were destabilizing the categories at the same time as they were doing that, and that hasn't helped the left. Again, I'll say that hasn't helped the left. All you've ended up with, for example, is a clash between trans rights activists and gender critical feminists, which is essentially a clash between different schools of postmodernism in terms of eliminativists or revisionists, the people who want to make strategic revision of gender so as to liberate people who are oppressed, which are the trans activists, and the people who want to eliminate the so you have the revisionists and the people who want to eliminate it, hence are critical of it. They want to deconstruct it completely. And so you have these conflicts between people, but it's mainly cast in terms of encounters, if you like, of lived experiences, and the ideal, the mentalistic is mentalistic, but the psychological is put in the forefront. So how do you resolve that? It's a conflict that can go nowhere except shouting.
Yeah, I noticed something in your videos, and you mentioned it again now. And so when you discuss the history of sociology, you of course there are the classic recurring founding fathers, and you mentioned Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, and you tend to describe Durkheim as more of an empiricist and a naturalist, someone who,
he wasn't as hostile as some of the others at that time.
Right. Whereas Weber, you present more as someone closer to the sort of more dominant trends in the humanities that has more to do with interpretation. So in this, in this sort of model, one should expect that the people in the contemporary social sciences who see themselves as the descendants of Weber would be more in the sort of postmodern interpretive camp. And actually, this is something I wanted to mention to you. There has been in the past few years also debates in the French context around the social sciences, what is really the sort of level of seriousness that is practiced there. And there was a book that started a controversy by two French sociologists, and of course they didn't reject sociology outright. I mean, it would be stupid and completely excessive, but they talked about some of the stuff we might both have in mind, sort of the tendency to project ideological readings onto the real world, to use these very simplistic reading devices, just like capitalism, oppression, patriarchy, to make them not only sort of emergent processes, but really agents in and of themselves with their own
evil
intentions,
spirits,
etc. And right, so to say. And the thing is, so in this book they were quite critical of this approach, which they claim is closer to the Durkheimian approach, and they recommend, on the other hand, a more they call it well, I would translate it as understanding practice of sociology, whereby instead of trying to decide that people act in certain ways because of some like overarching systemic reasons, you actually should try to look at what the real reasons are, because usually people have reasons for their actions which are really, from their own point of view and in some reading, rational. And this would be a more Weberian approach. So, there is this sort of different dichotomy whereby people who hope for a less militant sociology, unlike what is usually, I think, being done in the English-speaking world, tend to favor Weber. And I'm also now reminded of this book by
Mm-hmm.
Alan Bloom in the 80s, The Closing of the American Mind, wherein, more like you, he was sort of blaming Max Weber for sort of
I
introducing
don't,
American sociology
I don't
to
think
the
Weber was the worst by
sort
far.
of the
I think
reflexes of German philosophy.
I think particularly, I think his
Yeah,
proximity
of
to
course.
sort of neo-Kantianism, perhaps, especially after 1870 in Germany.
Hmm.
Perhaps I think that's where the distinction between the sort of the demonstrative hard sciences and the sort of the more interpretive sciences was grew from. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Tell me, how is pragmatism viewed in the French Academy? How the status of sort of pragmatism, especially the sort of American and English tradition?
I mean, I've never taken part in academia in the humanities or the social
I
sciences
see.
really, but because I've always studied the natural sciences, physics. But I mean, I have some preliminary knowledge of what happens sometimes in those other fields, and I think there is essentially no existence of this tradition in the French
So there's no discussion
universities. I
of
mean, maybe it's
Peirce,
an
for
exaggeration,
example,
but I think
or
it's very marginal.
that's interesting.
I really don't think there is much of that.
Because Rorty, of course, interestingly, was interested in postmodern French philosophy, but at the same time was an American pragmatist. But I think Rorty's is
Hmm.
often cited as an example of what you call the
Yeah.
wrong kind of pragmatism. That division that does go back to the division between Peirce and James, I think, runs deep. I think Peirce was much more influenced. Miss Sachs book's good on this. Peirce was a much more influential pragmatist philosopher in the UK. Via Welby and then Ogden to Ramsay, and that influenced all the English philosophers, analytic, ordinary language philosophers as well. But it's interesting as well. I've read in places that people like Derrida and Deleuze actually moved towards pragmatism themselves later, or that
Hmm.
as being some kind of solution to the problems that was raised in their category skepticism. And I think perhaps pragmatism is a healthy, or the right kind
Hmm.
of pragmatism, is a healthy way of addressing those attitudes that we've inherited from the neo-Kantians and perhaps the more idealistic, more phenomenological kind of schools of social science. And I think that's probably an interesting place to study it. But again, there's going to be this policing, alas, where if you view what is being done, the task that is undertaken, against which we judge the pragmatic standards, in anything like naturalistic terms, if you say what people are doing and are they doing it well, and all the kind of those pragmatic questions, if you start addressing that in terms of what's the evolutionary history of that, it doesn't mention evolution. Oh, there's trouble. That's going to be the problem. And like I say, I don't think it does the left. Ultimately, politically, it does the left no favors. I mean, I'm on the left. It doesn't. So I'd view it this way. It does no favors at all, because it basically surrenders the field of explanation, our best tools for doing that, to some very, very dubious people on the right. And why would you do that? Why would you break your weapons and retreat from the field of battle?
Yeah, I guess the answer is that they think they are standing on another
Yeah,
field
but
of
reality
battle, and
isn't
they think they
Twitter.
are winning, hands down.
You can get all your crew on Twitter, and you think all these likes. You go, oh great, this is my bit, and all those articles that echo your, and you can
Mm.
think that's great, but that's not reality, and you have to deal with reality.
To be fair, it's part of reality, but it's a small part, probably.
It's not so much of a constitutive part as people tend to think it is. It's this thing of having your mind in the forefront and
Yeah,
material events in the background.
right. Yeah. So I think it's a good transition to my next question, because we briefly discussed on Twitter once.
Ah, yes.
We discussed this book by Peter Singer, A Darwinian Left, And I wanted to ask you about this because I've been meaning to read it for a while. Of course, as for many other
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
I can retreat behind the phrase "so many books, so little time." But so I haven't got around to it yet, not even close. But I'm very interested to
It's a good
hear
book.
about it
Yeah, I
from
mean,
someone
look,
who's actually
it's
read
it's
it.
quite old now, 1999, but I think it's a good introduction to what possibly how we could
Yeah,
have a Darwinian model that breaks from who was the American who coined the term Darwin social Darwinism? I've forgotten his name.
is it Richard Hofstadter?
It is Richard Hofstadter. That's the guy. Yeah, that's right. That's it. He was Richard Hofstadter. I can forget that. I was going to kick myself. There he is. Yeah, Richard Hofstadter's book, 1940 something. I think early 40s. He wrote the book Social Darwinism, and that just said because you have this idea of nature red in tooth and claw. And at that same time, you had that kind of like Rooseveltian and sort of opposition to that.
Mm-hmm.
It gelled in the public imagination. It became that thing of Darwinism is this. It's capitalism red in tooth and claw. They're all competing. It's all terrible. It's all that appealed to some people. But other people, it was just like, oh, that's what we're against. We're against that. And I think what Singer's book was really good at was sort of saying, well, no, that's not necessarily the case, because if we look at how we are, we can take the Darwinian picture, and we can say, well, actually, we're quite cooperative. We're not that kind of species,
Mm-hmm.
and we're capable of actual things that are altruism, at least that look, to all intents and purposes, like altruism. Yeah, given the sort of like selfish gene hypothesis, that doesn't mean that we aren't capable. It doesn't mean we're genetically designed to be selfish in the economic sense.
Right.
And it was an exploration of those kind of ideas, and I think that was needed, and I think it's still needed,
Mm-hmm.
because the assumption, and it is assumption because fair play, there are neoliberal economists who make use of the Darwinian paradigm, yeah, but they don't own it necessarily. And there are things that we do in terms of cooperation, and the things that we do in terms of our sense of fairness,
Yeah.
that are well explained within an evolutionary adaptive model as well. Not necessarily just
Right.
adaptive as well, but the general naturalistic evolutionary approach isn't bound to a particular economic model. And I think that was the central idea, and I think that's a very good idea. I could be updated now because that was 1999, that was 20 years ago. But
There has been sort of an update recently. I haven't read it yet, but there is this book by Nicholas Christakis, right?
all,
Blueprint.
all right.
I haven't read it, but he makes the case that evolution has equipped us with many tendencies to be cooperative, to be helpful.
Sure.
Yeah.
And to respond badly and to respond vigorously to oppression or to injustice.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult. You can't really. There's this idea that if you just manipulate people, you can keep them docile. But
Mm-hmm.
that's probably a lot more difficult than people think.
It's not easy. I mean, both tendencies exist, of course, in humans, and both have roots in evolutionary processes. But yeah, I mean, you can't have one without having the other.
And it's good to know. It's good to know what's
Exactly,
going on, not
exactly
because
right.
you want to control and you do want to know how really good ways of fooling people. No, you can be a Democrat. You can say, look, if we know how to make democracy works, then ideas like public reason and putting things to the sort of the consensus of an educated population, a participatory and a discursive and a deliberative democracy. We can help us build a more democratic model because we better understand what's involved. It's not manipulative. It's not necessarily controlling in some kind of sinister way.
Right. And so, what were the reactions to this book, and does it still have influence? I mean, it seems to me it's not so influent, not even close, as, for instance, Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. I mean,
No, it isn't.
maybe because no one, I mean, very few people who see themselves as firmly on the left.
It's got Darwinian in the title. The problem is it's got Darwinian in the title.
Yeah.
And straight away that puts it at odds with the people who should be reading it.
And was it already the case back then?
Yeah.
When it was published?
Yeah. It was the 90s. And this thing was, I think the difference was, in the 90s, I can remember the 90s, and I remember that this kind of stuff, it was the same thing. I remember intersectionality, all those things, they were all there with the colourful hair, everything, you know, listening to the Riot Girl bands, all that was going on. Yeah, that was there. But it knew it was in opposition, and it had that kind of resigned look on its face that you get like New Labour or the left parties that knew that neoliberalism was in charge, whether they liked it or not. It had that resigned look on its face. It knew it was the underground. It knew it could be wild and radical because it didn't have a sniff at power. Post 2008, I think the situation has changed. Mm-hmm. I think there's a general shift away from what was the orthodoxy at that time, in both directions, left and right. And unfortunately, some of those ideas, it's a shame that there aren't new ideas. Some of those ideas from 20 or 30 years ago now have a sniff at power. And frankly, they're a bit too intolerant for me to be comfortable with that.
So again, I think it's a good transition to my next question, because I wanted to ask you about the intellectual dark web. You've mentioned this. Of course, it's something that it's not very well defined, which is probably one of its qualities. So it's something that's come up, sort of a spontaneous convergence, partial convergence of voices that have come up to probably coming from the same direction.
What's interesting for me is it is really heartening to see, even if I'm with some of the people who are linked with it, it's heartening to see. It's one of the places where you will see a kind of acceptance, or at least a open-mindedness to naturalistic explanation, and you will see people who are willing to say, well, hold on, I'm going to say this, and I want to say it fearlessly, and because there is far too much being cowed. Now, to be fair, it's the result of the right, what the right get up to, as well as the left. But in my specific thing that I'm interested in, which is the naturalization of the social sciences and what that can do, it's the left really that's the problem. There are people on the right who are the problem because they're exploiting that. I'll grant you that. That's true enough. And there are figures. To be honest, there are figures on the intellectual dark web like Dave Rubin who I find annoying. Yeah.
No arguments there. I mean, maybe 1 year ago, certainly 2 years ago, I would have disagreed with that. But I think I've come to.
I think Ben Burgess in a tweet to me described him as a doe-eyed tape recorder, which is fair. I think. I'm sorry, Dave, but I think that's fair. You have to be a critical thinker to be a good interviewer. There's people whose politics on the right, but that's the interesting thing, which it's unfairly criticised for, which makes me dubious, which makes me suspicious on my own side, is this kind of thing that Quillette has just become this joke about calipers and phrenology and that's being used as part of the go away science, go away natural science, you're evil, right wing, you're nasty. And there was that recent Nathaniel Comfort article in Nature as well.
Maybe you should explain this to the audience, because I have some awareness of it, but it's very recent, so I haven't had the time to sink my teeth into it, and I'm sure.
Well, part of the anniversary, Nature, the journal, rather than the realm of being, is 150 years old this year, I believe, and as part of their study, their celebration, as it were, of this period of time, they're inviting various historians of science and people who take a more long-term historical view to write commentaries in their, what you call it, their in-flight magazine rather than their actual research journals. They're sort of like their front piece. And in that series, Nathaniel Comfort, who's a professor of history of medicine at Johns Hopkins, I think it was on. Let me have a look. It was on the 8th of October. Wrote this rather bizarre piece in which he sort of like takes issue with the scientism of revising the social or the natural picture, the manifest image of humanity in light of the scientific image or picture of humanity. It is in a rather bizarre way because, okay, he goes through the stuff about how Huxley and so forth were sort of like not particularly politically correct. Francis Galton invented eugenics and all that. Of course, we all know that story, and it's the 19th century. Their values don't compare well to our values, as judged by our values, clearly. But then there's this bizarre bit where it's like the developmental sciences, in particular IQ, represent the evils of the white, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic white male.
This is
they're
stuff
bad.
It sounds to me like stuff straight out of the 80s.
It very much so. It's got that feel about it. It's got that kind of like crass plastic jewelry feel of it from the kind of like 80s. Yeah. But whereas, strangely, according to this, immunology, which breaks down the barriers of the self and has this corporatist, corporalism, this corporeal kind of body metaphor. You can see he likes that more, even though, historically, and he should know this, that's the stuff the fascists were into. The idea of the diseased tissue needing to be cut away, which is kind of like more ecological and immunological and less sort of based around individualism. That's the spurious stuff. But again, this is because, of course, if you come from a radical progressive perspective, you're more likely to be a methodological holist when it comes to explaining social phenomena. Rather than a methodological individualist, you're going to look at the whole picture and the social system rather. But the problem is that the far right do that as well. That is something that's quite horseshoey. Away from the centre, you move away from methodological holism. But ultimately,
you move towards. As you move away from the centre, you move towards methodological holism.
You do, yeah. I think that's there's some truth to it. But ultimately, it just comes down to this thing like collapsing the demarcation issue into an ideological issue in that, what pseudoscience is? Pseudoscience is science whose politics doesn't agree with mine. It was that kind of claim. And that's like, well, hold on a minute. That's really? And because that sort of turns up in nature, and nature does have, for its 150 years of history, does have a reputation, a high reputation, even though it's effectively it's in Flight magazine rather than its actual research publishing arm. Steven Pinker responded, and then Comfort responded back, and there was this big hoo-ha backwards and forwards. And of course, Quillette gets mentioned in this, wearing calipers, naturally. Again, they set the two sides off against each other. Now, it's strange for me, but I find myself, at least on the issue of the role of naturalism, more sympathetic with the interdiction with the dark web. I might have more sympathy. In a way, I have more sympathy. I think there are things in the natural revision of the social that actually does question at least some of the more extreme forms of liberal individualism, the kind that underpins the neoclassical models of economics and the neo-libertarian ideology, where people so totally own the products of their labour. That taxation is theft. I do question those because I'm a democratic socialist. And I question them from a naturalistic perspective. So maybe I don't agree ideologically with the dark web on that, but I have to say I agree with them intellectually and epistemically. The fact that there's articles like this being published that are clearly political in motivation rather than, they're a political viewpoint on the history of the science. There might be a place for that, but is it something connected with a journal that is called Nature? You'd assume that the journal called Nature has some kind of commitment to the naturalistic sort of ideas and that kind of perspective. And then there's other articles come out in the day or two since, which is it's all phrenology. If any kind of scientific measuring approach is equated to phrenology, including somebody was suggesting that type reduction theory is like phrenology, but which it isn't, because it's into theoretic reduction, and phrenology wasn't. It was just like a suggestion based on an idea that wasn't true. Was phrenology even pseudoscience, or was it bad science? And also, of course, science, like Darwin, like evolutionary theory, started out as proto theories that weren't particularly strong. These things have to grow, and it's knowing how to judge. And if people are cynical towards truth, if they don't think there's a way of doing that, if they don't think there's a way of dividing science from non-science, the predicate, just, being able to say is science and attribute it to something or not, even if it's to draw a distance to or from science rather than draw a distinct line between science and pseudoscience, then all you have is the basis for both white fragility and fake news, which is you just judge the politics of the person in front of you, and you think that settles it, and you don't have to think, and that's not a good thing. I don't think that's a good thing.
I mean, I think there is an extremely strong case to be made it's always worked like this, more or less, between sort of laymen in public debate, especially when politics were involved. But what's striking is the extent to which these methods of supposedly resolving questions and examining arguments, I mean, how common they've become in academia.
I mean, they're often a way of avoiding doing that. It seems to be much more efficient to that point of view if you can just judge somebody on what their tribal affiliations are, or what newspaper or media outlet they work for, and then say, oh, well, that's just white fragility. Oh, that's just fake news. Oh, that's just, and it's a kind of cynicism, a kind of disrespect for truth, and a kind of lapse into bullshitting in the Frankfurtian sense. That's the malaise. That's bad. And you notice I'm not specifying that on either side of any political divide either. Both sides are doing that. And that's the problem. And I think one of the good things of science is the promotion of science as a virtue, even of what you could call the pro-science attitudes of the scientist, which would be a form of scientism in the original sense of the word. That's good. It's good to promote that, because that's a way of alleviating that problem. And all this kind of talk of calipers and it's all phrenology. If you measure somebody's skull craniometry, the only reason you doing that is because you're trying to make racial differences. There could be no possible other reason than that you want to measure the differences between people, not even medical. It's all terrible, and it's the disrespect for truth, and that's something that people who work in the academy or as scholars cannot put up with. That's a red line.
Yeah, well, strong words indeed, but I think they are needed. I've reached the end of my questions, Gary. Is there something you think we should cover? Something else? Yeah.
I think we've covered quite a lot.
Okay. Then
I certainly got ranty at the end there, but I'm a bit worked up about these kind of things.
I think a rant is always a good way to end things. Yeah. So thanks again for coming on the podcast. It was a fun discussion, as I was expecting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.